Hi to everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Vicente Scarti for this kind invitation. And today I will talk about subjectivity and power between Étienne de la Boétie and Michel Foucault. So let's start. There is a booklet that remained almost unknown for centuries and then re-emerged to the collective consciousness, offering a fundamental perspective on the pervasiveness of power. I refer to the Discours de la servitude volontaire by Étienne de la Boétie, the beloved friend of Montaigne. According to la Boétie, every form of government is intrinsically despotic. Indeed, whether power is inherited or taken by force or even received through election by the people, it is always repressive. Although la Boétie acknowledges that there is a difference between those forms of government, he sustains that, quote, leur manière de régner est toujours à peu près la même, unquote. Now, what is important to point out is that la Boétie is not interested in the legitimacy of power, but in the effect of enslavement the power always verified. This is the reason why his essay is still extremely interesting, even if we live under democratic regimes. Unlike what we used to think, despotism is not simply based on the coercion of power. Despotism is also, and above all, based on people's free obedience. This is the reason why la Boétie wonders why people agree to serve a power that subjugates and enslaves themselves. A radical and untimely question compared to the historical period in which it was asked, but also rational in the end. Indeed, it is not evident that if everyone stopped serving the tyrant, there would no longer be any tyrant and people would consequently be freed from his or her shadow. If it is true that power is based on people's obedience, then it is sufficient to remove that obedience to see the tyrant fall. The system based on their obedience will simply cease if its condition of possibility were removed. The problem is that for la Boétie, people do not just sustain the luxuries of the tyrant, but also that they control each other to be sure that nobody escapes his or her duty. In this way, they make themselves both victims and oppressors of the tyrant's power. Conforming to the power, ensuring that others also respect the law, and invoking severe punishment for the outlaws, does not mean being a good citizen, but a slave of the tyrant that does not just exploit people as workforce, but also as an arm to pursue those who refuse to let themselves be enslaved. This is the despicable trap to which people fall into, receiving la Boétie's blame. If in fact it is their servile obedience that gives the tyrant the power to subjugate them, then people should blame themselves, even if it is evident that la Boétie's target is the despotic authority of the tyrant. He overturns that perspective, indicating that submissive people are responsible for their own condition. However, it is precisely from this perspective that la Boétie incites his fellow citizens to rebel. The revolt which la Boétie calls his fellow citizens is a non-violent revolt. This is very important. For the young thinker, violence is in fact not necessary to free oneself from the tyrant's yoke. It is sufficient to remove the roots of power, the substance from which it lives, to see it die out. While this argument may appear simplistic and quite naive, it is important to recognize the impact it had on the history of political thought and thus how people conceive of power and fight against its abuse. First of all, La Boétie discourse represents an absolutely novelty for the history of political theory. If in fact the tyrannicide of those who break the divine law was widely theorized by the mediaeval tradition, the possibility of removing the tyrant simply by ceasing to submit to his or her will, it is a conceptual novelty introduced by La Boétie himself. Actually, a truly radical novelty, since it does not prescribe how to eliminate a single tyrant, but to eliminate tyranny itself. To stop serving the power apparatus means in fact to jam the gear of power itself. What is removed is not simply a pawn, a single pawn, that can be easily replaced by another, but the entire chessboard of authority. Working by subtraction instead of action, La Boétie's nonviolent perspective redefined the concept of action for political theory, and consequently within the political arena. His theory has been in fact received and developed by thinkers who had an impressive impact on people's way of thinking and reacting to power social constraints like Thoreau, Tolstoy, and more recently Foucault, as we will see in a minute. La Boétie is however well aware of the difficulties linked with the liberation process. People are in fact so used to being under the tyranny's control that they do not even dream of being free. According to La Boétie, the worst and most fearful trap of the tyranny is habit. Indeed, although, quote, la nature de l'homme est d'être libre et de vouloir l'être, unquote, it is also deeply adaptive and pushes people to accept even the worst situations. Furthermore, even the most archaic societies are not divided in two parts, the tyrants on the one side and the servants on the other side. Between the two, there is a hierarchical pyramid that increases the numbers as much as decreases the conceptual tools that allow people to understand and rebel against their unbearable situation. La Boétie schematized the concept by stating that the tyrant directs his order directly to, let's say, 6 advisors, who exercise their power over 600 people, who exercise their power over 6,000 people, and so on, to the most miserable level of society. It is precisely because everyone belongs to that pyramid network of power relationships that the tyrant can reach every single person. But what makes La Boétie's pamphlet incredible compared to the period in which it is written is that he underlines not just the overwhelming power of the tyrant, but the pervasiveness of a capillary power that uses individuals' freedom to repress that same freedom. If in fact it is evident that the pyramid increases in number the more you get close to the base, it is also evident that it is very difficult to find yourself at the bottom level of social hierarchy. This means that you are compelled to obey the system in order to exercise your power over lower level people. The paradox of modern society that based their development on social mobility and people's freedom is that you have to obey even more if you want to climb the social ladder. Indeed, capitalist societies have not eliminated the servile obedience that sustained feudal relationship. They have simply replaced a tyranny of flesh and blood with a tyrannical bureaucratic system that pursues a despotic economic development. From this perspective, when it comes from cunning or ignorance, whether it comes from hope or fear, quote, la raison et le secret de la domination, le soutien et le fondement de toute tyrannie, unquote, is always the obedience to power in order to maintain one's petty privileges. If La Boétie shows the voluntary aspect of servitude, it is with Foucault that it is possible to show its involuntary aspect. According to Foucault, power is not something that someone like a tyrant can possess. Power is something that is exercised under certain circumstances. This does not mean that people are now finally equal and free. It means that, unlike the 16th century, power has branched out into society more and more, covering every aspect of it. In Surveiller et Punir, Foucault has shown how the evolution of punishment corresponds to the evolution of society itself. It because the 18th century the convict was conducted to the central square to be publicly tortured and executed. It was because the punishment should show the power of tyrant. But this spectacular manifestation of power was highly ineffective at the political level. The punishment was in fact carried out in a very arbitrary and heterogeneous way, ending up being fundamentally anti-economic. Only with the advent of nation-states does power change face and start to act in a more rational and economical way. Instead of executing a few convicts in the most spectacular ways, society tries to grab them all. Society starts to imprison and discipline them in accord with a model that is no longer repressive but productive. But unlike what we used to think, Foucault shows that the reasons that sustained this change were not linked with a supposed humanitarian evolution of society, but with the slow transformation of the subject into a homo economicus. It starts with what Foucault has many times called a, quote, discipline anatomopolitique du corps humain, unquote, that no longer has interest in punishing people, but prefers to make them goods that produce and consume other goods. Within this transformation of society and the relative bureaucratization of its structure, power spread within the social fabric, becoming increasingly sneaky. Indeed, power is no longer embodied in the figure of the tyrant, who has the right of life and death over subject, but has taken the form of social interaction mechanism regulated by bureaucrats, doctors, psychiatrists, judges, pedagogues, etc., etc., who interact within architectural structure, forming the network of knowledge which dramatically decide people's life. Biopolitics is nothing but this dense fabric of relationship that expropriate from people's life the possibility of deciding on this same life. Certainly, as La Boétie underlined, power extricated itself within a pyramidal relation of servitude and patronage, but it came from a very specific point, the tyrant. Nowadays, power is everywhere, and it is much more difficult to resist its pitfalls. Furthermore, power is no longer perceived as something external to fight against, or, as La Boétie suggests, that can be defeated by ceasing to serve. Power is internal to the very mechanism of sociality, and it is perceived as something that serves the well-being of the citizens. All protocols aimed at safeguarding the health of citizens, arranging their lives safely, are decided by structure that, in pursuing a doubtful progress, impose on people the limits within which they can move, love, work, live, etc. The problem is that this network that Foucault defined as dispositif, is not visible in its pervasive force, although it has subtly entered the life of citizens, deciding what is good for them. Indeed, people do not simply endure the dispositif from the outside, they embody it and give it life with their life, since they involuntarily think of the world and themselves within the conceptual category that they inherited from the dispositif itself. Using a metaphor, we could say that the tyrant is now within us. But if this is the case, how can we resist power? How can we critically approach society to create a moral space at the margins of power? The problem is very complicated, since its resolution would imply the subject's skill to place him or herself outside the conceptual link with which he or she has learned to distinguish good from evil. But unfortunately, this skill is conceptually and historically impossible. As there is no possibility of situating oneself outside the power, so there is no possibility of situating oneself outside of history. The problem is that the moral perspective that we are looking for in order to criticize the despotism of power is itself the result of history. Every moral judgment is an historical product. This is evident in the different perceptions that have historically accompanied acts that today we do not hesitate to consider criminal. In classic antiquity, for instance, to imprison, sell, or even kill a disobedient son or an unfaithful wife was guaranteed by the patria potestas. Although with different status and roles, children and wife belong to the head of family as much as the slaves. These last were just considered a available object. Available object is exactly as Aristotle defined them. In that time, the people who were socially blamed were not those who exercised their power legitimately by those who rebel, but those who rebel against it. Another example is offered by Todorov in La Conquête de l'Amérique, where he explains that during the Conquista, the conquistadores did not hesitate to feed their dogs with the natives' children. As gruesome as it may seem, this image would not have been so unbearable for the European of the 16th century, since the debate on the possibility that the natives were human beings or not ceased only after the Pope's encyclical, without really changing the way indigenous people were treated. Indeed, although Pope Paul III, Pope Farnese, declares in the encyclical of 1537 called Sublimis Deus, but also known as Excelsus Deus or Veritas Ipsas, that, quote, Indios veros homines esse, means Indios, indigenous people, are real hominem, real people. And again, the people who were blamed were not the conquistadores, but the blasphemous sauvage who worshipped naked the demonic statues. This is the dramatic truth. Analyzing how the perception of these crimes has changed, merely congratulating how much humanity has developed in the meantime, means failing to recognize the fundamental contribution that Foucault's criticism has offered to the political understanding of the society in which we find ourselves, affirming values that we may one day discover being deeply unhuman. Although it is difficult and maybe impossible to escape the axiological context that produces us as subject, it is important to remember that moral values are always historical instants, and as such, they are neither absolute nor right in themselves. From this perspective, taking Foucault's criticism seriously does not mean withdrawing from the games of power in the hope of not being defiled by them. It means learning how to stay at the margins of power with an awareness that the values we inherited from the society in which we live are historical and therefore structurally fallacious. If with La Boétie we understand that freedom is something that must be gained by resisting power instead of yielding to it, with Foucault perspective, we understand that resistance cannot be based on a blind trust in the value that our society affirms. We should in fact always remember that values, even those that seem to be the clearest expression of human development, could one day be revealed as the expression of an awful past. Thank you very much for listening, and have a good day.